The last transmission from the Vanguard came like a hymn and a grenade pressed together, short, bright, then gone. It was a private code, an emergency signature the fleet used in moments when comms would do more harm than good. On the Solace, the message was a single line of data that shattered the air. Final burst, collapse achieved, no survivors. The consoles coughed static and then silence. For a handful of heartbeats, the ship's occupants seemed to breathe the same cold, stunned air. Arlen Hayes had been in command of the Solace for less than a year. He had taken the posting to be away from the press of the Vanguard's maneuvers, away from the endless drum of tactics and death that still thudded in his bones from a life of fleet action. He had traded the deck plate and the shuttle platform for cargo manifests and family rosters, hoping to fold into the quiet work of human transport. His wife, Tessa, had laughed at him and kissed him and called him stubborn for choosing exile from the thing he'd once led. That choice seemed inconsequential now. Around him, the carrier hummed with the noise of ordinary life trying to be ordinary. Children scrawled games on datapads in the rec corridor. Elderly couples argued over rations and the best way to season competi. There were rows of cots and the gentle calls of family names. For many on the Solace, the Vanguard had been a promise, a distant shield that kept the Velnari brazen in their halls and quiet on their borders. For the families, the Vanguard was more than war. It was bread, lullaby, promise of return. Then the message arrived. Outside, stars glimmered as always. Inside, everything unmade itself. Arlen slid into the command alcove as if the old reflexes pulled him like an anchor. The ship's screen showed the outer system, a ragged cluster of smoking wreckage where the battle had just ended. The void held the smell of ozone and dust even across the bandwidth. The live feeds had already started to come in, Velnari signals claiming victory, their faces bright on hollow panels as they recited prepared lines about strategy and sacrifice, not of humanity, but of their own tactical genius. They were polished PR with the edges of a blade. Reckless. Dangerous. One Velnari senator declared on an open channel, the words designed to cut and wound and be heard by as many ears as possible. The actions of the Terran fleet endangered the system. We regret any losses. Arlen listened until the lacquered tone from the Velnari feed stopped registering as language. It became instead a smear of betrayal, an effect he could feel in his teeth. He moved through the ship like someone underwater. People recognized him, some with hope, some with blankness because news had not yet reached everywhere. But when mothers and children turned to him, their faces asked a question he had no right to answer with confidence. He told them what he had to. The Vanguard sent a final signal. The rift collapsed. No one alive to verify beyond instruments and the washed-out recordings. The Solace had been meant to go home. Instead, it held the last witnesses and the last consignment of hope. Log entry, Captain Arlen Hayes. I told them to keep their routines. It felt cowardly to tell a child to finish breakfast while the world rearranged itself, but routines are scaffolding when ceilings fall. I don't know if I was trying to protect them or protect myself from falling apart in front of them. Word spread across the sector, slow at first as relay nodes mirrored conflicting accounts, then fast as Velnari channels pushed their narrative and free feeds tried to push back. The Velnari were grateful to be saved, and grateful in a way that meant gloating. Their news anchors hummed the same lines about disciplined sacrifice, the hazards of unregulated tactics, and the chaotic hazard of Terran recklessness. The Empire's speech crafted a victim and a villain, and carved out a monument to its own supposed valor. The dead could not protest being miscast. On the Solace, the children kept asking where the fathers and mothers would be coming home from, eyes bright and trusting. There were faces Arlen had never seen, sisters of pilots, parents of technicians, people who clung to the deck like driftwood. He had told Tessa he would get them all off ship and into safety if anything went wrong. He had told her that more than once, with the shaky bravado of a man who imagined war could be kept at the maps table. The Velnari's next move stripped the last of that imagined safety away. They issued a capture order. It was delivered not in a whisper but in a tone meant to behave as law. The Solace was a vessel of interest, a last vessel of survivors who might carry classified knowledge, and therefore subject to immediate seizure by Velnari authorities for inspection. The order was posted to the public channel with procedural calm that stank of malice. Captain Hayes watched the live feed of a Velnari frigate decloak outside their orbit with a composure he did not feel. The frigate's commander spoke, a voice perfectly courteous and free of pity. "Surrender for boarding. Compliance ensures safety." That word, safety, hung in the air and tasted like the rest of their polished lies. On board the Solace, families argued. Some said we must comply. The Velnari will take care of us. Others wanted to step on the drives and run. The ship was not a warship. Its engines were not designed for the violent maneuvers the Vanguard once executed. It had no heavy turrets, no reinforced bulkheads, no hardened combat crews. The Solace was a spine of cots and kitchens. Arlen's hand closed around the rail until his fingers ached. He had been a man who once held worlds between thumbs, who had led squadrons in maneuvers where lives were a currency. Now the currency was children, and he had a ship full of people who trusted him with their lives. The decision was a blade. He had orders and a conscience. The law of the cluster sat in one ear. The law of blood sat in his chest. "Open channel," he said. The Velnari commander's image filled the screen, calm, arrogant, and younger than Arlen expected. "Captain Hayes of the Solace, we order you to open your hatches. We will conduct a humanitarian boarding. No harm will come to your people if you comply peacefully." There are moments when a man knows with the same clarity as breath that a promise is a lie. Arlen felt that certainty like a physical thing. "Negative," he said. "I will not voluntarily allow my people to be dispersed for propaganda. You will leave, or we will make for the fringe and disappear." The Velnari response was polite. "Your refusal will be treated as an act of hostility. We will exercise necessary measures." What followed was not a siege painted in missiles and screaming. The Velnari did not need to burn the Solace to break them. They had already shown themselves able to control the narrative. They had the political apparatus. They had the authority. They had the legalistic pretense to send in boarders under the banner of order. Boarding parties were deployed and the Solace's hull was breached in a soft, surgical way. Airlocks cycled with legal calm, and a Velnari delegation stepped aboard with polite smiles and the quiet efficiency of administrators rather than warriors. Inside the rec hall, a Velnari officer moved among the families like a minister, offering statements about safe custody and orderly procedures, while others took notes and sealed containers of personal effects. They spoke soothingly about relocation, assurance, and eventual reunion. Each word was a rope, spun to bind and persuade and make the bewildered accept the new regime. It is no small thing to watch an officer read calm sentences while they steal the world from you. Arlen moved like a live thing. He marched to the rec hall and demanded access. The Velnari commander blocked him, citing regulations. "Captain Hayes, you must understand. This is standard medical checks, debriefings." Arlen saw the lines of families being led to the transit corridors, children's hands guided into cold palms that did not belong to them. He saw Tessa's face. She was always good at standing at a door and making it feel like home. She turned, their eyes met, and for a second there was a fold in space where time and love braided. He pushed past the Velnari. "Arlen," she mouthed, no words loud enough to reach him, but a whole life compressed into a single look. Those eyes held trust, the kind of faith that never asked for proof. Before he could close the distance, the Velnari shifted, and the hands that took his family away were not ones he could meet with fists or commands. They were protocol. They were policy. They were a coordinated system of bureaucratic removal that rewrote the map of his life in a single motion. The Velnari told him to stand down. They insisted this was for the children's safety. They informed him that families would be transported to the Velnari relief cluster pending investigation and protective custody. Their faces never betrayed the truth. This was not protection. This was capture masked as mercy. Arlen watched them board the convoy transport in a surreal flash. Cots, children, the small personal tokens of lives, an old photograph, a toy. The doors hissed closed. The transporter hummed. The convoy folded into hyperspace under Velnari escort. He had a ship full of witnesses left, and an empty space where his family should have been. If grief has a voice, it was that low, stunned silence that followed. It screamed in Arlen's chest with no sound. Log entry, Captain Arlen Hayes. They called it. Protective custody. They strapped my life into labeled boxes and walked it out through the airlock. Tessa looked at me with a face I have forever associated with calm dinners and ridiculous sweaters. I saw it again at the airlock, and the moment stretched into a history of things I would never touch again. They took her. They took her voice. I cannot help but feel I failed. Outside, Velnari broadcast painted a different mural. Their anchors praised the orderliness of the operation. They framed the solace as an uncooperative contagion. The senator's lines about reckless Terran tactics became a drumbeat that justified the seizure of witnesses. Even as the convoy accelerated away, the Velnari turned the image into proof of humanity's chaos. See, they resist. See how dangerous they are. On the Solace, there were no weapons to scream with. There were faces, and fear, and the quiet shuffle of people caught between immediate panic and the need to keep children calm. Some of the oldest veterans on board, men and women who had been quiet since the Vanguard, met in a bitter, whispered circle. One of them had once been a petty officer in a rearward logistics group. Another had been a maintenance lead. They were not soldiers by current assignment, but they remembered. They remembered formations. They remembered the way panic could be used by those with no conscience. Arlen convened them in the cargo hold. The ship sagged with sorrow, an enormous low groan that sounded like a mourning. He felt small among foreign grief. He took in faces, breathing faces that had just been crushed by the Velnari's rhetoric, faces whose partners had been taken. We are not a shell, he said to them. We are not empty. We are the last witnesses. We have the duty to survive not for ourselves, but so their story does not die with them, they argued. Some wanted to pursue the convoy, run the Velnari vessels, risk everything to bring their families back. Arlen held up his palms. We cannot win a pitched battle, he said. We have a carrier with families. We are not a destroyer. If we lose this ship, we lose every voice still left. Survival first. Truth second. Justice later. He could have been wrong. He could have been coward. He could have chosen fire and ruin. But in those minutes, with the rec hall empty and the nursery a room of ghosts, his burden was a clear thing. Build strength quietly and use it when it counts. Log entry, Captain Arlen Hayes. I promised Tessa I would get the children to safety. The promise was not a slogan. It was the edge of what kept me human. I tell myself that I am keeping faith with that promise by not sacrificing everyone now. But the lie crawls under my skin. Perhaps I made a promise I could not keep. They fled. Into the outlaw lanes. Outlaw space isn't a place on a map as much as a state of being in the galaxy. Systems that had been cut off during the collapse wars, stations that traded in second chances, despots who liked to think themselves free from empire law. It was a place where people could be invisible if they paid the right price. It was also a place where the Velnari's long tendrils did not reach immediately. The Solace folded into the fringe with a ragged breath. Among the passengers, a brittle sort of order returned, rationing, whispers of routes, plans to disappear. Arlen organized convoys and routes on the ship's scratch pads. He met the eyes of children and told them stories about stars becoming blankets and the Vanguard being watchful spirits. Those were half-truths spoken to keep small hearts beating. But the loss carved him. The world rearranged itself around the absence of Tessa and the others. People who had once boasted of loyalty to Empire now shook their heads. The Velnari had not only taken family, they had redefined the relationship between human virtue and Velnari gratitude. The Empire had called their mercy into question and, in doing so, branded the survivors as dangerous. Arlen could see the embers of fury in the faces around him. Grief had a shape. It bent into accusation and then edged toward action. When survivors looked at one another, they did not only see loss. They saw motive. The frontier offered little comfort, but it gave time. Time to breathe, to learn who else among the refugees could wield tools or remember how to wield weapons, to find allies who owed the Velnari old debts. Arlen knew he needed engineering hands and pilots who could change a carrier's anatomy. He needed quiet places to splice new rigs and arm the old hull. He needed to keep this ship alive as proof that the Vanguard's names would not be buried beneath propaganda. Log entry, Captain Arlen Hayes. Tonight I lay awake and counted the rhythms of the ship like a metronome. They keep me steady. I keep thinking of Tessa's laugh, the way she would fold her hands over my wrist at odd moments, and I am ashamed at the smallness of that image. To ground myself in a laugh seems too domestic given what we face. But it keeps me whole. I will need that wholeness if I am to keep these people whole. At the end of the act, the Solace found shelter among a cluster of derelict way stations. The hull of the carrier shuddered with the engine's low hum, and around them the dark opal of outlaw space glimmered with 1,000 unregulated fires. They had slipped away with some witnesses. They had lost others, taken under the tangled legality and performance of the Velnari. The word "lost" sat heavy and raw. And Arlen, who had once walked the decks of warships with the quiet knowledge of men who knew how to make a decision, found himself altered by the day. The office of captain felt less like a job and more like a covenant, something sworn by oath and blood. He did not yet know how to shape a revenge that was righteous and true. He only knew this: the empire that owed them everything had spat on their sacrifice, taken their people, and convinced the galaxy to look away. That was intolerable. He would survive. He would gather. He would learn how to bend a carrier into a weapon. He would make their names visible again. The Solace's lights dimmed into the outlaw night. Voices hushed. Somewhere in the station a baby fell asleep, and an elder hummed a lullaby that had survived centuries of war. Arlen sat at the command alcove and wrote his log. Log entry, Captain Arlen Hayes. They took them through a closed door on a sunny day, and my life rearranged. I cannot say I am brave yet. I can only say this: I will not let the world forget those who kept it. If the Velnari think burial is comfortable for them, then let them watch the ground burn. For days, the Solace drifted through outlaw space like a ghost trying to remember its name. The engines hummed with uneven rhythm, their tired pulse echoing the exhaustion of the people inside. Grief was no longer a sudden burn. It had become a low, constant ache that settled behind the ribs. Arlen Hayes moved through the decks quietly. He spoke to families, he checked the ship's pressure seals, he inspected the fuel readouts with hands that remembered command consoles far more complicated than these. But all of it happened beneath a heavy, invisible weight. His family was gone, taken by the Velnari, carried away by a convoy that never sent word, never responded, never acknowledged the families on board the Solace again. In outlaw space, news moved like whispers. The Velnari claimed those civilians were being relocated for their safety. But the people on the Solace had lived too long under Velnari arrogance to trust a word of it. More than once, Arlen stared at the empty space outside the viewport and imagined the convoy's path. In his mind, he saw Tessa with the children, calm, reassuring, believing he would find them. Believing he would make the galaxy make sense again. He closed his eyes whenever those visions came, because he could not carry them and lead at the same time. And he had to lead. Hashtag the first steps toward rebirth. The Solace was running on minimal power when they found the derelict station. A skeletal structure of metal and half-lit corridors floated alone among drifting asteroids. A forgotten mining hub from the collapse era, part refuge, part ruin. Arlen sent a small team aboard to search for supplies. The station smelled of dust and old machinery. Panels flickered. Rust and where spoke of decades abandoned. But it had power. It had scrap. It had space. Most importantly, it had privacy. As families unloaded ration crates, blankets, emergency lights, Arlen walked the station's ring corridor and felt something stirring. Not hope. Not yet. But potential. A station like this could hide a ship. A station like this could host repairs. A station like this could become a cradle for transformation. One of the elders, Lena Merrow, whose daughter had served in the Vanguard, approached him with a datapad and shaking hands. "We want to help," she said. "We're not soldiers, but we're not helpless." Behind her, a group of engineers, techs, and older veterans gathered with the same fierce expression, anger sharpened into focus. Arlen looked at the datapad. It was a blueprint, the Solace, reimagined with armored plating, rerouted wiring, reconfigured engines. A crude outline, but unmistakable in intent. "You want to rebuild her," Arlen said softly. "We want to survive," Lena answered. "And after what the Velnari did, survival means strength." More voices joined. "We won't be hunted again. No more being herded like livestock. If the galaxy won't listen to the truth, we'll make it impossible to ignore." Arlen felt the air in the room shift, tightening with the pull of something larger than raw emotion. Maybe grief reshaped itself into tool and purpose. He took the datapad. "Then we begin. Asterisk, if the Vanguard taught us anything, it's that grief can become discipline, and discipline can become force. I'm not shaping these people into warriors. Grief is doing that without me. I'm only trying to keep them from burning too fast, too bright. If Tessa saw what we're doing, I don't know if she'd be proud or terrified. Maybe both. Asterisk. ## outlaw space allies. But rebuilding a civilian carrier into a fighting vessel wasn't something that could be done alone. They needed alloys, drive coils, shutdown relays, photonic shielding, materials outlaw space did not give freely. On the third day, their first visitor arrived. A pirate ship, rusted, ugly, angular, dropped out of drift with weapons powered but not aimed. The captain appeared on the comms, leaning back in a chair with amused curiosity. "You're the humans running from the Empire," she said. "We've been hearing stories. Thought we'd see if any of them were true." Arlen didn't flinch. "Depends on the story. That you're angry," the pirate said. "And that you're rebuilding." Arlen didn't answer. He didn't need to. The pirate laughed. "Good. I hate the Velnari. They taxed my people until we left our homeworld. I think we can help each other." Her price wasn't money. Outlaw space didn't care much for currency. Her price was humanity's promise, a future alliance, a shared enemy, a shared cause. The pirate captain delivered crates of scavenged alloys, laser cutters, forgotten tech from ruined convoys. Other outcasts followed, station traders, refugees, even ex-soldiers from species long oppressed by the Velnari Empire. In outlaw space, the Empire's lies held no power. Here, truth breathed fire. The Solace transformed. Civilians welded plating to its hull, raw, uneven, but strong. Engineers rerouted the main drive through salvaged thrusters. Children carried tools and learned drone controls from old veterans. Deck B became an armory. Deck C became a training hall. Deck A became the mind of the reborn ship. The corridors rang with the sound of drills. The air tasted of sparks and metal. The shadows hummed with determination. Even Arlen changed. He spent long nights in the engine bay, repairing parts he knew by touch. On the hull, he replaced maintenance panels with armor. In the command alcove, he reconfigured navigation paths to leverage asteroid clusters for ambush maneuvers. People watched him, trusted him, leaned into his presence. To them, he wasn't just a captain, he was a reminder of the Vanguard, the last link between who they were and who they needed to become. Asterisk, I was never meant to lead again. But leadership is not a medal. It's a burden that settles on the shoulders of the last person standing. Every time someone calls me Captain, I hear the voices of the real captains who died in the collapse. I don't pretend to carry their strength. I carry their absence, and somehow that is heavier. Asterisk. Weeks passed. The Solace, now bearing scars and new armor, waited for its first trial. It came when a Velnari reconnaissance patrol slipped into outlaw space, scanning for unregistered Terran vessels. The patrol consisted of 2 sleek cruisers and a command shuttle, small enough for scouting, strong enough to be lethal. They did not see the Solace at first. Arlen saw them immediately. He gathered his officers in the command alcove. "This is not vengeance," He warned. "This is survival. If they find us, they'll call the fleet. We don't fire unless we must." But the Velnari hailed them with false courtesy. "Terran ship, identify yourselves. Failure to comply will be treated as active resistance." The words sounded almost identical to the ones spoken before his family was taken. Arlen's breath tightened. "They're not leaving without us. Or without calling more ships." The families gathered in the hold. They didn't tremble. They didn't argue. They waited for Arlen's command as if the moment were already decided. "Bring us into the mineral fog," Arlen said. "Keep engines low. Prepare drone units." The Solace drifted into a thick field of mineral dust. Visibility dropped. Sensors flickered. The Velnari cruisers followed, confident in their superior navigation systems. That confidence was a weakness. The first strike wasn't an explosion. It was a misreading. The Velnari scanners, blinded by mineral interference and thrown off by decoys deployed from the Solace, misjudged distance, barely, but enough. One cruiser clipped an asteroid fragment, destabilizing its shields. The Solace moved. Drone units, piloted by teenagers who once played harmless simulation games, swarmed the cruiser, jamming its comms and forcing it to retreat. The second cruiser attempted to flank them. Arlen ordered a maneuver no civilian captain should know, a rolling dive between asteroid fragments, slipping under the cruiser's line of fire without touching the throttle. The move stunned his own crew. The Velnari commander realized too late that they were not fighting refugees. They were fighting people who had lived under the Vanguard's shadow. The Solace didn't finish them. It didn't need to. The Velnari fled and left no survivors, because retreat was easier than admitting helplessness. When the silence finally returned, the families on board the Solace looked at one another with something new, recognition. They had stood together and faced the empire that betrayed them. They had survived. And in that survival, something sharp and bright took root. Not rage, not vengeance, but resolve. We fought without meaning to become fighters. And they ran. Our people are not soldiers, but grief is a forge. What emerged today was not a weapon. I refuse to call them that. What emerged was proof that the Velnari do not understand us. They see us as reckless, primitive. They think fear keeps us small. But fear only teaches us what matters. A week after the encounter, the outlaw feeds buzzed with a staggered, fragmented transmission, an emergency broadcast from a border world. A Velnari flagship, the Imperial Radiance, would soon hold a Senate gathering to pass a decree. Terrans would be labeled a destabilizing species. All remaining Terran ships would be detained, and the Vanguard's sacrifice would be erased from history. Families gathered around the projection in stunned silence. "They're going to bury the truth," someone whispered. "They already tried," another replied. "Now they want to finish the job." Arlen stared at the glowing Senate crest on the projection feed. The Velnari had taken everything. Now they meant to destroy the truth itself. He felt something cold and certain click into place inside him. "This is where they make their lies permanent," he said. "This is where they pretend the Vanguard died for nothing." He raised his head. "So we will go there. We will not bow. And we will not let them rewrite the world." For the first time since the loss of his family, the fire behind his eyes did not tremble. It burned. Captain's log, Arlen Hayes. The Velnari think they've already won. They think the galaxy believes them. They think humans will fade into pages they edit. Let them gather their Senate. Let them shine the radiance. Let them rehearse their story. We will attend their performance. And then we will make sure the galaxy sees the truth. The meeting was held in the lower hangar bay, once a storage space, now turned into the closest thing the Solace had to a council chamber. The people of the ship gathered shoulder to shoulder, some still wearing welding gear, others with datapads of tactical sketches, others holding their children close. The projection of the Velnari Senate crest hovered in the air, shimmering like a warning flare. Arlen stood before them, still wearing the worn jacket he'd arrived in weeks ago, now patched with soot and flecks of alloy dust. He didn't dress like a commander. He didn't need to. Leadership came from what people carried toward him. He spoke quietly. They think the story ends with us. Silence deepened. They think the Vanguard's sacrifice can be buried beneath speeches. They think the families they seized are forgotten. They think we're scattered, frightened, and alone. He looked at the battered ship surrounding them, its armor uneven, its wiring exposed, its shape beautiful in its defiance. They are wrong. A lone murmur rolled through the crowd, not applause, but recognition. They meet on the Radiance in 3 days. Every species in the Senate will be watching. Every news feed will be transmitting. Every diplomat will be speaking the words the Velnari hand them. His voice hardened. But we have something the Velnari don't understand. We have truth. We have each other. And we have the will not to let our dead become footnotes in someone else's speech. A hand rose. A young girl named Kaylin, no more than 12, whose mother had been taken in the same convoy as Arlen's family. "Captain," she asked softly, "are we really going to the Senate?" He knelt to meet her gaze. "We're going where the truth must be heard. And if they try to stop us?" He didn't flinch. "Then we make sure they can't." The room held its breath. Then the ship's oldest engineer, Lena Merrill, stepped forward and placed a hand on Arlen's shoulder. "Then let's get to work," she said. The Solace, reborn now in spirit as the ghost of the Vanguard, entered its final transformation. Outlaw welders aided from battered shuttles. Pirate engineers contributed cloaking tech stripped from stolen corvettes. Refugees added deep-range jammers capable of silencing an entire fleet's sensors. It was chaos and brilliance braided together. Hull plates overlapped like scars. Shield emitters flickered with unsettling strength. Engine coils hummed with a new pitch, higher, sharper, purposeful. Arlen walked the corridors, feeling the ship becoming something no empire ever intended a civilian carrier to be. Not a battleship. Not a fleeing refugee craft. Something else. A message forged in metal. A warning written in engines. A promise wrapped in armor. Every crew member felt it too. The corridors, once heavy with mourning, now rang with a steady determination that bordered on reverence. They weren't just rebuilding a ship. They were rebuilding a reason to live. I told myself this wasn't a war. I told myself we only fought for survival. But the moment I saw the Senate crest, I understood. Survival without truth is surrender. And surrender is not something the Vanguard taught us. If the Velnari want to rewrite our story, then we will write it in light where the galaxy must see. The Imperial Radiance was more than a flagship. It was a floating symbol of Velnari's supremacy. Polished halls, towering spires, a shield array second to none. The Senate gathered there for moments of great pomp and greater arrogance. As the ghost approached the secure sector, the radiance shone like a small sun, golden plating reflecting the starlight in steady pulses. Inside its grand Senate chamber, delegates from dozens of species took their seats. Many were uneasy. The Velnari's recent rhetoric felt too sharp, too eager to reshape the galaxy in their own image. But the Velnari senator in charge of the decree, Silas Prime, stood tall and smiling. "Today," he announced, "we address the Terran question. Their interference has cost lives. Their recklessness threatens peace. Their existence must be regulated." He raised a hand. "Bring forth the evidence." Screens flared to life around the chamber. Doctored recordings. Cut audio. Simulations showing Terran aggression. The lies were polished. Convincing. Deadly. And then a tremor rolled through the radiance. Not enough to frighten, but enough to interrupt the speech. "Commander?" a senator whispered. "What was that?" Silas smiled thinly. "Routine maneuvering, I'm sure." It wasn't. Every sensor operator in the Radiance's command deck jerked upright at the same moment. "Unregistered vessel decloaking, directly above us." "What class?" They stared at the readings. Confusion turned to disbelief. "Unknown. Large. Civilian configuration, but modified." The ghost of the Vanguard dropped out of cloak. A jagged silhouette. A scarred carrier made whole with uneven plating. A ship that should not exist. Its engines burned with a fierce blue-white flame that cut against the radiance's gold. Across the Senate chamber, enormous screens flickered to life, automatically streaming the external view. The delegates gasped. "That's a Terran vessel! But how? Is that ship even allowed in this sector? That can't be right. What happened to the Solace?" A Terran representative, one of the few still welcome at Senate gatherings, stood from his seat slowly, eyes wide. "That," he said, "is no longer the Solace." The ghost broadcast a signal on every open channel. "This is the last ship of the Terran Vanguard families," Arlen's voice declared. "We come with truth." Senator Silas tried to override the feed. "Shut them out. They have no authority, no right to broadcast." But the ghost jammers tore through the Radiance's systems like a blade through silk. Every screen in the chamber now displayed the ghost's feed. Every comm line routed to it. Every diplomat forced to watch. Arlen appeared on the projection. His face was calm. His uniform unpolished. His eyes full of grief and iron. "I am Captain Arlen Hayes," he said. "Former officer of the Terran Vanguard. Father. Husband. Survivor." He paused, long enough for silence to settle. "The Velnari Empire claims the Vanguard died through recklessness." Silas hissed. "Cut this off," Arlen continued. "They lied." He transmitted the recovery of the Vanguard's black box logs. The real orders. The Velnari command's cowardice. The Vanguard's sacrifice. Gasps tore through the Senate. Some delegates stood in shock. Others looked sickened. The illusion had cracked. And Arlen wasn't finished. Asterisk, if you hear this, it is because the truth matters more than my life. They took our people. They hunted us. They tried to silence us. They called us primitives, reckless. But strength is not measured in words spoken to a camera. Strength is measured by who stands when the world burns. The Vanguard stood. And now, so will we. Asterisk. Hashtag the Velnari panic. Silas shouted for security forces. Commanders rushed to activate weapon batteries. The Radiance's shields powered up. But the ghost was already moving. Not to destroy, not yet. First to reveal. It swept above the Radiance in a slow, deliberate arc, projecting holographic images of the missing families. Mothers, children, elders, faces the Velnari had tried to erase. Delegates cried out. Some covered their mouths. Some demanded answers. Silas looked shaken for the first time. "This is a Terran fabrication. They seek to manipulate you." But his voice cracked, not with confidence, but fear. Because the ghost wasn't firing. It was telling a story. And the galaxy was believing it. Finally, when Silas barked the order, "Destroy that ship!" Arlen stepped forward in the ghost's command alcove and gave his final command. "Activate the Vanguard Lance." The Lance was not a superweapon. It wasn't a planet killer. It wasn't designed to slaughter fleets. It was a truth carrier, a precision kinetic tool built by Vanguard engineers for emergency extraction, shaped in a way the Velnari had never seen. The lance streaked through the void in a clean, bright arc. A symbol, not a massacre. And struck the Radiance's shield emitter array dead center. The array overloaded. Shields collapsed in a shower of harmless sparks. The golden glow around the Radiance flickered and died. No delegates were harmed. No citizens injured. No lives taken. But the message was unmistakable. Your lies cannot protect you. The Senate chamber erupted, not in destruction, but in revelation. The Empire's armor, literal and political, had crumbled. Arlen's final message played across every channel in the system. You cannot bury the Vanguard. You cannot silence their families. You cannot rewrite our dead. He exhaled slowly. We do not seek domination. We do not seek war. We seek justice. And justice begins with truth. He ended with a line that would later be carved into monuments across the free worlds. Humanity remembers. Humanity survives. Humanity rises. The ghost engines flared. It turned away from the radiance, and it vanished into outlaw space before the Senate could react. We did not destroy the radiance. We destroyed their silence. My family is gone, whether dead or locked away somewhere the Velnari dare not speak of. But the galaxy knows now. They know the Vanguard weren't reckless. They were the only ones brave enough to stand. And now we carry their fire. We disappear into the dark not as fugitives, but as the Vanguard's ghosts. And we will not be forgotten again. Asterisk.